Hello there, and welcome to episode 3 of my Lancastrians and Yorkists vlog. This time we're going to be talking about Henry IV and why he's able to survive through into his reign from 1399 to the end of Depth Topic 1, which is 1405, which is a slightly kind of strange, maybe slightly controversial, maybe slightly contrived finishing point, but nevertheless that's where we're going. And the big questions here are: why was Henry IV able to survive? How important was the Duchy of Lancaster? And what is the impact of France and Scotland as external powers upon Henry and his kingdom? We're going to start with the external threats to start just to begin with, because they provide a bit more of a framework for us. So if we talk about France at the beginning, Richard II had actually been born in Bordeaux, in southwest France. He had married the daughter of the French king, Isabella, and he was relatively pro-French in his policies. Bear in mind that 28-year truce that had been agreed in the Hundred Years' War as a result of the marriage that he'd arranged with the French king's daughter. And this, of course, all added up to make Henry IV pretty unwelcome as a usurper, even though Henry IV had received support or help as Henry Bolingbroke from the Duke of Orleans, the king's brother, the French king's brother. What probably didn't help after becoming king is that Henry IV was quite reluctant to return the 9-year-old dowager queen, Isabella, Richard II's widow, back to France. He should have sent her back straight away with her full dowry. He sends her back reluctantly, kind of hoping to hang on to her to marry his son, and thereby cement some sort of alliance. When he does return her, she goes back without the dowry, very naughty. French peeved about this. And in fact, the Duke of Orleans twice challenged Henry IV to personal combat to settle the matter, which Henry IV obviously turned down rather dismissively. He said, the Duke of Orleans it should be a king that challenged me, not just a duke. Anyhow, as a result of this poor start from Henry IV with his French policy, the French put pressure upon England in a number of areas. Firstly, in Gascony, which is south-westish, about kind of halfway down the Bay of Biscay, and was English territory at the time, even though nowadays it's part of France, part of Aquitaine at the time. The French king declared the Dauphin, the heir to the French throne, to be lord there in 1401. And Richard II had been quite a popular presence in Gascony as well. So this was problematic for Henry, and it became more problematic in 1403 when the French invaded, raided Aquitaine. Henry actually does quite well. He fights off, he retreats, but he fights off those things, and he does manage to win over the local nobility onto his side in Gascony and sort of holds the line there. In the north, the French had, in 1404, launched 2 naval attacks on the south coast, and that was expensive, along with problems with piracy in the English Channel. This got Henry into trouble, not just with supporters of his own on the south coast, but also with the Hanseatic League, a commercial network of traders who were obviously didn't want to lose goods of their own to pirates. So all in all, the French threat was medium, I would say. It declines after 1407 because of French infighting at home, but this time it's kind of an annoyance and irritation. It's not sort of a full-on attempt to get rid of him. I'll come back to them slightly in a few minutes. There was also something of a threat from Scotland. Henry IV seems to have wanted peace with Scotland, but Robert III, King of Scotland, wasn't happy with the way that Henry had seized the throne. He called him a usurper. And that triggered a big invasion of Scotland in 1400. 15,000 troops were taken by Henry IV, very expensive. And they get to Leith, Leith, near Edinburgh, helped by the defection onto the English side of George, Earl of Dunbar. Dunbar is Dunbar. But that action wasn't decisive. Problems kind of rumbled on until 1402, when Dunbar, along with Northumberland and Hotspur, defeated the Scots in what seems to have been a relatively decisive battle at Homildon Hill. Homildon is Homildon, Homildon Hill, which seems to have ended things by and large on the Scottish border. Certainly ended it from a threat. From about 1404, that the Scottish infighting amongst themselves meant that they were less focused on England in any case. Henry does also strategically use his family to try and make things a bit easier for himself. In 1402, he married Joan of Brittany, the widow of the Duke of Brittany. Brittany is the northwest pointy out bit of France, and this made for an alliance with Brittany, who at that time wanted independence from France. Think of them as a bit of a sort of mirror image of Cornwall in England. In the same year, 1402, his daughter, Henry IV's daughter Blanche, married Ludwig, who was the eldest son of Rupert, Count of the Palatinate of the Rhine and King of the Romans. He is next in line to be the Holy Roman Emperor, it's probably the easier way of putting it, and an effective ally against France on their eastern border. And in 1406, slightly beyond our period, he married his daughter Philippa to Eric, King of Norway, Sweden and Denmark, which helped repair some of those fractures with the Hanseatic League. Henry also invited the King of Portugal and the King of Castile, which nowadays is part of Spain, to become members of the Order of the Garter, sort of creating a bit of an informal alliance with them. So just all round on the foreign threats, they are a problem for Henry, but you could say also they served to concentrate the minds of several of his nobility. Northumberland, for instance, is kept quiet and engaged in the first couple of years of Henry's reign by the threat of the Welsh and the Scots. And there certainly were other lords who thought probably that we should deal with the external enemy first and then work with Henry to make things better here. So they are a problem. The Scots aren't really strong enough to cause too much damage, although that was expensive. The French are irritation rather than ever becoming big enough threat to Henry's position to overthrow him. Internal revolts there's kind of four main ones in this time. The Epiphany Rising we talked about last time, with the Hollands, which was fairly easily sidestepped. They were trying to get Richard II back on the throne, and probably that led to Richard II being certainly allowed to die in Pontefract Castle. The biggest and most problematic revolt was in Wales. We'll talk about that first. That's led by Owain Glyndwr. Glyndwr is Glyndwr, who had, for various reasons, fallen out with a local neighbour. Henry hadn't intervened to sort things out, and a bit frustrated and probably egged on by supporters, Glyndwr was announced Prince of Wales in 1400. That in itself is a rebellious act. And he then attacked and burned Ruthin, which is where the person who was in dispute was from. Ruthin is Ruthin, Ruthin maybe. At this stage, Parliament refused to give Henry IV any money for an army. Perhaps just hinting back to that thing we said last time, that Henry had said, I will survive on my own means. And they were sort of challenging him to do that. And for a lot of the Glyndwr revolt, Henry IV leaves his son, Henry, later Henry V, to be nominally at least in charge of affairs in Wales. So this is where Henry V gets his kind of apprenticeship, if you like. However, in the period we're looking at, up to 1405, things tend to go more the way of the Welsh. Glyndwr adopts some guerrilla tactics. The English come in, they fight a few battles, they get rained on a lot, and they pull out, and suddenly Glyndwr and his supporters flood back in. In 1401, the Welsh have a big victory over the English despite having a smaller army. In 1402, they capture Edmund Mortimer, uncle of the heir to the throne, Edmund. Mortimer then marries Glyndwr's daughter and says, I don't like Henry IV, he's a usurper. I would much prefer my nephew, Edmund Mortimer, to be the king, and he's the right king anyway. That's problematic for Henry, an irritation again. In 1402, Parliament was growing so frustrated by the Welsh revolt that it passed a law which said you couldn't sell food or armour to any Welsh person, no public meetings or bearing of arms was allowed in Wales, and no Welshman could hold a castle or public office. Now, this is an indication actually of how seriously Parliament were taking the revolt. So this is 1402, big news and problematic for the English. In 1404, that's underlined with 2 or 3 underlinings and maybe a couple of exclamation marks by Glyndŵr capturing both Aberystwyth and Harlech castles. Now, if you look at them, they're royal castles put in place to control Welsh territory. They are right out there on the western coast of Wales, and that sort of shows where where Glyndŵr's stronghold was, around the north and the west. But by 1405, the majority of the countryside of Wales is in Glyndŵr's hands, or is broadly supportive of Glyndŵr. It is a big problem for Henry IV. Also, in 1405, Glyndŵr and Mortimer. Glyndŵr and Mortimer sign what's called the tripartite agreement. Tripartite's spelled exactly how it sounds. Tripartite, I-T-E on the end. They say Glyndŵr, Mortimer, Northumberland, Percy's his surname, Earl of Northumberland, and their agreement is to split England and Wales between them into 3. And the French also send over 2,500 men to back Glyndŵr, but that all comes to nothing. They sort of march through Wales, face the English, and then turn around and go home again. So although 1405 looks like it's really bad, already I would argue we're reaching a turning point. There are some defeats going on. The tripartite agreement is a bit of a busted flush, as we'll see later on. And the rebellion rumbles on until 1415, but the English gradually unpick Glyndŵr's successes. So that is problematic, and I would say the biggest threat to Henry, although it's more of a threat to his reputation and his status as king, more than to his actual place on the throne, I would argue, because they're not seeking to defeat Henry and replace him as king, they're seeking to gain Wales for the Welsh. So finally, 2 other rebellions to tell you about in England. Hotspur's rebellion. This happened in 1403. Henry Hotspur was son of Henry Percy, the Earl of Northumberland. And the Northumberlands together were both upset had been upset with Richard II, and initially were quite happy to support Henry IV. And he gave Hotspur land and responsibility on both the Welsh and the Scottish borders. Hotspur, incidentally, was his nickname from his speed of attack against the Scots. But Hotspur quite quickly became disillusioned with Henry IV for a number of reasons, and we think chief among those are that Henry IV gave land to Hotspur's rivals rather than to him, and after the Battle of Homildon Hill, where they defeat the Scots decisively, Henry IV takes the prisoners to ransom them, trying to make back a bit of cash, rather than allowing Hotspur and others to ransom them themselves and make their own money out of the battle, having taken the risks in the fighting. This seems to have led to Hotspur's rebellion in 1403, which is pretty short-lived. Hotspur and his uncle, the Earl of Worcester, join together in an army and go to Shrewsbury on the Anglo-Welsh border, where they fight a battle, which they lose. Hotspur dies in the battle. Northumberland, his father, is upset and goes off to Scotland. Henry V is wounded quite badly in this battle, and quite famously, but that's really the most notable thing about it. Final rebellion to talk about is Scrope's rebellion. This is in 1405. Scrope is spelled S-C-O-R-P-E, and Richard Scrope was the Archbishop of York. He seems to have been a friend of Northumberland all along, sort of some family connections between them. Scrope joined with Thomas Mowbray, who was the Earl of Norfolk, and Northumberland in a rebellion in 1405. Scrope and Mowbray were together in Yorkshire, and they got their army together, but they stood their army down when they were promised that they'd be listened to and dealt with fairly. Probably it was about taxation, a bit about Henry's attitude probably to the nobility. But having promised that they'd be listened to, Henry IV then has Scrope and Mowbray put on trial and they're executed. This is super controversial because he's the Archbishop of York and they're executing, obviously, a member of the clergy. And actually that was then claimed to be behind a collapse in Henry IV's health by people at the time. Northumberland, incidentally, had been joining the rebellion from the north, but he fled back to Scotland when it failed and his lands were confiscated. So that's the end of him as a threat-ish. Although in 1408 he does try to come back down south and with a smaller army is defeated fairly straightforwardly again in Yorkshire. And he's hanged, drawn and quartered after already being dead and his body's displayed, his head's displayed on London Bridge rather. So, how much of a problem was all this for Henry IV up to 1405? Well, it's an interesting question. I think up to 1405 it is still a problem. He is dealing with things, but he is able to deal with each one as they come, and it does help Henry IV that he has a viable heir who is helping him out and learning the ways of the trade, and that other options die. Richard II, of course, himself, he's no longer in prison. Hotspur dies. Northumberland flees to Scotland. Mortimer, like the heir Mortimer, is under lock and key in Windsor. So on the one hand, I would say that there are powerful opponents. The monarchy is diminished by the way that Henry has grabbed control of it, and people are perhaps more willing to rise up against Henry than they might have been against a more legitimate king. There were certainly a number of Welsh victories and territorial control, and the opposition to France meant there was a threat to the territories of England in what we'd call France today. So, serious stuff. But Henry does defeat his opponents. By 1405, most of his rivals are dead or controlled. He is forming alliances with the next Holy Roman Emperor, with kings of Portugal and Castile. He has definitely put down the Scottish threat. So the threats are fading, and even from 1405 you can see the Welsh threat declining too. I would therefore argue that if you get a kind of change continuity question, how much of a problem was this? That at the start it was potentially quite a big problem, but over time it becomes less serious for him. And if you're asked about the biggest factor in survival, well, the fact that there's no obvious alternative as a ruler to Henry IV is quite big. I think that the child, Edmund Mortimer, not really backable at this stage. Other people that have died, or Owen Glendower is Welsh, no one's going to back him in England. So there's no obvious alternative to them. And also the Duchy of Lancaster business that Henry is able to just about raise enough money to deal with these threats properly. So I hope that gives you some ideas about how to approach that. Sorry, it's been quite a long one. Next time we'll bridge the gap to Henry V and start looking at depth topic 2. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.